Welcome back to the part 2 video on the Littorio class battleships. In this episode, we will go through the operational life of these ships and their performance in combat, summarizing the clashes in which these battleships took part. For the technical overview, please check out part 1. The Vittorio Veneto entered service on the 28th of April 1940. While the Littorio was delivered to the Regia Marina on the 6th of May. In the following 4 months of summer 1940, the two ships underwent further completion works necessary to make the two units fully operational, in particular the fine-tuning of the main armament. It took more than anticipated and was subject to some inconveniences, including a fire erupting on the Littorio in early July. At the end of August, the two battleships were finally ready and were able to participate in their first combat mission. This was the attempt of the Italian fleet to counter Operation Hats, a series of British naval movements across the central Mediterranean, aimed at resupplying Malta and reinforcing the Mediterranean fleet with the battleship Valiant, the aircraft carrier Illustrious, and the cruisers Calcutta and Coventry. The bulk of the Italian fleet, with 5 battleships, left Taranto at dawn on the 31st of August. But the strict dispositions from Supermarina, the Navy High Command in Rome, limiting the fleet speed and the area of operation, basically prevented any contact between the two opponents. At the end of September, another operation aimed at resupplying Malta was put in motion by the Royal Navy, this time from Alexandria. 2 light cruisers had to deliver men and supplies to Malta, covered by the entire Mediterranean fleet. The Italians sighted the enemy movements, and the Italian fleet commanded by Admiral Campioni with Littorio and Vittorio Veneto departed on the 29th to intercept. Faulty air reconnaissance, but most importantly the strict dispositions of Supermarina, prevented Campioni to intercept the enemy. The conduct of the naval war so far had been centered on the concept of the fleet in being. This was on paper the right choice, given the overall strategic position of Italy. However, this was interpreted in a too strict way by Admiral Cavagnari, the Navy Chief of Staff, consequently reflected in Supermarina's directives. On the 11th of November 1940, the Royal Navy launched its famous raid against the Italian fleet based in Taranto. During the attack, the battleship Littorio was hit by 3 torpedoes. At 11:15 p.m., the first one struck below turret number 1, on the starboard side. This hit occurred at the limit of the area protected by the Pugliese defense system. The second torpedo struck at the extreme stern, on the port side. These 2 hits did not compromise the ship, and no serious countermeasures were required. At 11:59 came the third hit, which opened a huge hole in the bow section outside the area protected by the Pugliese system. The water started to flood the ship and caused failures to the electrical apparatus that knocked out some of the water pumps. Around 4 a.m. the situation was deteriorating, with the bow slowly sinking. Captain Girosi ordered to strand the ship in the shallow waters northwest of the Mar Grande. The operation was completed at 6:27 a.m. According to the sources, the major cause of the sinking of the ship was the failure of part of the electrical apparatus and the water pumps. Some of the electric cables were not waterproof, causing blackouts and further water infiltrations. These deficiencies, caused by minor design flaws and by the hasty completion, were subsequently fixed on both battleships. The Littorio was refloated and moved to the dry dock of Taranto at the beginning of December, and at the end of March 1941 it came back in service. For a full coverage of the Taranto raid, check out my live show with Dr. Alexander Clark. With the Littorio temporarily knocked out, the Vittorio Veneto remained the only modern battleship available to the Regia Marina. Together with the rest of the fleet, it was moved to Naples the morning after the Taranto raid. Contrary to the popular belief that Italian battleships remained hidden in harbor after Taranto, only a few days later the Vittorio Veneto, together with the Giulio Cesare, sailed to intercept a British formation escorting the aircraft carrier Argus. This old carrier was meant to get closer to Malta and launch 12 Hurricanes to reinforce the defenses of the island. When news came that the Italians were at sea on an intercepting course with a superior formation, Admiral Somerville ordered to launch the Hurricanes in advance and turned back. The result was that only 4 fighters reached Malta. At the end of November 1940, the Vittorio Veneto, accompanied by Giulio Cesare, participated in the Battle of Cape Spartivento, where it fired for the first time a few salvos against enemy warships at long range. On the tactical level, Cape Spartivento was an inconclusive encounter, but the Italians failed to stop the British movements between the western and eastern Mediterranean. Once again, the reason could be explained by the faulty air reconnaissance and perhaps by the cautiousness of Admiral Campioni. However, he was subject to some vague directives from Supermarina, and he was responsible for the only 2 available battleships at that moment. After Cape Spartivento, the Regia Marina experienced a change of leadership. Admiral Campioni was replaced by Admiral Iachino as commander of the battle fleet, while Admiral Cavagnari was replaced by Admiral Riccardi as Navy Chief of Staff. In early February 1941, Admiral Iachino sailed on board the Vittorio Veneto to intercept Force H that had ventured eastwards from Gibraltar. The British intentions were not clear, and the Italians deployed their fleet in the area between Sardinia and Corsica to be in a position to move either south or north. Later, news came that Force H had bombarded Genova, and Iachino set an intercepting course, without no clear news or sightings of the enemy. Unknown to everybody, he was on the right course to intercept. However, aerial reconnaissance exchanged a French convoy moving from Toulon to Algeria for Force H. Thus, Iachino changed course, ordering battle stations, but soon he discovered the error. In March 1941, the Vittorio Veneto ventured at sea once again, this time participating in Operation Gaudo. This operation was aimed at hitting British convoys sailing from Egypt to Greece. Aided by decryption of radio messages, Admiral Cunningham rightly guessed the Italian intentions and prepared the intervention of the Mediterranean fleet. In the morning of the 28th of March, there was the first skirmish between Italian and British cruisers. After a brief pursuit of the British light cruisers, the Italian ships withdrew towards the Vittorio Veneto, still not sighted, while the enemy cruisers turned back once again, shadowing the Italians. At 11 a.m., the British light cruisers came under the fire of Vittorio Veneto and immediately reversed course to escape out of range. The pursuit was halted at 11:25 when torpedo bombers flown from HMS Formidable attacked the Italian flagship, but with no results. At this point, Admiral Iachino wisely decided to turn back and head for home since he was deep into enemy waters, under constant risk of air attack and with no realistic hopes of receiving constant air cover. Additionally, the enemy cruisers were out of range, and with no convoys to prey in the area, the mission was over. During the clash, the Italian flagship fired a total of 94 shots at ranges between 23 and 25 kilometers, way beyond any optimal or semi-optimal range. The distance was rightly estimated, but the salvos were judged too dispersed, with only HMS Orion reached by a few splinters that caused light damage. In the afternoon, a new attack from the air came, and this time at 3:21 p.m. a torpedo reached the stern section, knocking out the external propeller on the port side and forcing the ship to a halt. A few thousand tons of water poured into the ship, but damage control worked properly, thanks also to the lessons learned at Taranto. 1 hour later, the ship was able to steam at 12 knots and later 16 knots. With Taranto still 420 nautical miles away, Admiral Iachino ordered all his forces to concentrate around the wounded battleship, to defend it from further attacks. The next air attack managed to cripple the cruiser Pola and initiated the chain of events that led to the disaster of Cape Matapan, a topic which is beyond the scope of this video. The Vittorio Veneto and the rest of the fleet reached Taranto on the 29th of March and spent 3 months in the dockyard for repairs. By July 1941, both Littorio and Vittorio Veneto were again operational. Their presence forced the Royal Navy to assign a strong escort to the next convoy destined to Malta. In September 1941, Operation Halberd saw the participation of 3 battleships, Nelson, Rodney and Prince of Wales, the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, 5 cruisers and 18 destroyers. Once again, the Italian fleet departed to intercept the enemy formation, which was subject to air attacks, during which battleship Nelson was damaged. Admiral Iachino eventually decided to withdraw, based on the information he had received and the directives from Supermarina, dictating to engage only in a condition of clear superiority. With hindsight, Iachino's decision was perhaps correct given the balance of forces. The 2 Littorios remained inactive until December 1941, when the crisis of Axis supplies directed to North Africa called for drastic countermeasures. To overcome the supply crisis, the Regia Marina committed its battleship force into the fray of the convoy battle to push through a series of vital convoys. In preparation for the mission, the Vittorio Veneto was reached by a torpedo launched by the submarine HMS Urge. The ship embarked around 3,000 tons of water, but could continue its march to Taranto at 23 knots. Spent 2 months in dockyard and was again operational in March 1942. On the contrary, the Littorio saw intensive action in the period that followed. From the 16th to the 19th of December 1941, the battleship escorted an important convoy directed to Libya. The mission was successful and the supplies delivered allowed Rommel to relieve his position in North Africa and get back on the offensive. En route to Libya, the Italians ran across another British convoy destined to Malta. And there was a brief exchange of gunfire between the respective escorts, which is labeled as the First Battle of Sirte. The Littorio fired 27 shots at 31-32 kilometers, which, not surprisingly, scored no hits. The Littorio participated in another similar mission in January 1942, which also granted the safe passage of the supplies. In March 1942, the Littorio participated in what is known as the Second Battle of Sirte, an attempt to block another British convoy running from Alexandria to Malta. Sea and weather conditions were extremely rough, and the British formation made up of cruisers and destroyers laid a dense smoke screen. Admiral Iachino decided to set a course parallel to the smoke screen, slowly pushing it to the south, and delaying its march towards Malta. During the battle, the Littorio fired 194 shots at distances between 11 and 17 kilometers. Splinters and near misses damaged the cruiser Penelope, Euryalus and the destroyer Kingston, while the cruiser Cleopatra received a hit from the Bande Nere. When darkness approached, the Italians withdrew. The next day, the convoy was exposed in daylight to air attacks, which sank most of the merchant ships. The missing supplies forced the Royal Navy to organize yet another large operation to resupply Malta. This came true in mid-June 1942, with the twin operations Harpoon and Vigorous aimed at pushing through 2 convoys coming from Gibraltar and Alexandria respectively. Admiral Iachino sailed with the Littorio and the Vittorio Veneto, the cruisers Gorizia, Duca d'Aosta, Trento and Garibaldi, and 12 destroyers to intercept the eastern convoy, led by Rear Admiral Philippe Vian, who had no battleships and only cruisers and destroyers as escort. Vian became informed by air reconnaissance of the Italian battle fleet presence and knew that his heavily outgunned formation stood no chance against the enemy force. Vian decided to wait, in the hope that Iachino would have withdrawn in the face of submarines and aircraft attacks. The Italian ships were attacked by British torpedo bombers that crippled the cruiser Trento and by American B-24 bombers that lightly damaged the battleship Littorio. Eventually, the Italian formation pushed through and forced Admiral Vian to turn back to Alexandria. During the return voyage, the Littorio received yet another torpedo hit from an enemy aircraft. The weapon struck almost in the same location as the third hit of the Taranto raid. This time the damage was lighter and the damage control worked effectively, limiting the flooding to 1,950 tons of water. The ship was again operational at the end of August. That episode of June 1942 was the last relevant war action of the Littorio and Vittorio Veneto. The worsening situation of Italian fuel reserves forced to limit the movement of all battleships, including the third Littorio, the Roma, which became fully operational in August 1942. In addition to the lack of fuel, there were fewer and fewer destroyers available for escorting the battleships, since they were more and more absorbed by convoy escort duties, while the losses constantly increased. In December 1942, facing the increasing threat of Allied strategic bombers, the three Littorios were transferred north to the base of La Spezia, where they remained until September 1943, periodically visited by Allied bombers. When Mussolini was deposed in July 1943, battleship Littorio was renamed Italia. This was done to progressively remove any reference to the fascist symbols or names. Following the armistice between Italy and the Allies, announced on the 8th of September 1943, confusion and uncertainty spread among the armed forces. According to the armistice terms, the fleet had to move to an Allied-controlled port. However, this was a hard order to give, and many officers were in favor of scuttling the ships. For the scope of this video, I will limit myself to just describing the fate of the three battleships after those chaotic events. In the early hours of the 9th of September, the bulk of the Italian surface fleet left La Spezia, led by Admiral Carlo Bergamini. The formation consisted of the battleships Roma, Vittorio Veneto and Italia, 3 cruisers and 8 destroyers, plus 4 torpedo boats. A few hours later, the formation was joined by 3 other cruisers coming from Genova. The fleet steamed south, passing westwards of Corsica, and entered the Gulf of Lasinara around 12:15 p.m. Setting course for the naval base of La Maddalena. At 2:24 p.m., Bergamini received news from Supermarina that German forces had attacked and overrun the base. At 2:41 p.m., the Admiral ordered the fleet to reverse course to exit the Gulf. Around 3:10 p.m., a formation of 28 Dornier bombers of the Luftwaffe appeared over the Italian ships, flying approximately above 6,000 meters. Bergamini had the order of not initiating any hostility against the Germans. He could only respond to offenses from the latter. The bombers were flying very high and in a position not favorable for any attack with conventional bombs. However, on that day, the German aeroplanes were equipped with a new kind of weapon, the radio-guided bomb known as the Fritz X. This new weapon had to be launched from above 6,000 meters, thus benefiting from a high penetration power. Most importantly, the crew of the bomber could adjust its course via radio impulses. The first bomb was launched against the cruiser Eugenio di Savoia. At first glance, the bomb looked like a signaling flare, given the smoke trail left behind. The bomb landed in the water, causing no damage. After the explosion, the entire fleet opened an AA barrage fire. However, the Luftwaffe bombers were flying out of range. A second bomb landed near the Italia, causing some light damage. A third bomb was directed at the Roma and hit the battleship on the starboard side near the 90mm AA guns. The bomb penetrated the hull and exploded in the water. A fourth bomb was dropped against the Roma, this one being the fatal one. The bomb penetrated the deck on the port side, near the forward triple turret of the secondary battery. The explosion ignited the magazines of the 152mm shells, which in turn ignited the 381mm shells magazine. This erupted in a huge explosion and blast of fire. The explosion and the extreme heat compromised the structural integrity of the battleship, which soon started to leak on the starboard side. Hundreds of sailors died in the initial explosion, together with Admiral Carlo Bergamini and Commander Adone del Cima. Many others died due to the hot steam flowing out of the hull. In 20 minutes the Roma capsized and then sunk. Around 1,300 crew members died that day, sinking with their ship or dying in the water. One last bomb was directed against the Italia. It penetrated the upper deck, but then exited from the starboard side, exploding in the water near the hull. The Pugliese defense system absorbed most of the shock wave, and the ship could continue its march. Vittorio Veneto and Italia steamed towards Malta, where they linked up with battleships Warspite and Valiant. The majority of the Italian surface units started to cooperate with the Allies for the rest of the war, but the two battleships suffered a grim fate. They were interned in the Great Bitter Lake, north of Suez, where they remained until 1947. The peace treaty allocated the Vittorio Veneto to the UK and the Italia to the USA. However, the two Allied powers gave up the two war prizes and forced Italy to dismantle the ships. They remained in La Spezia until their demolition was completed between 1951 and 1954. The never completed fourth Littorio-class battleship, the Impero, remained semi-sunk in Trieste until 1941, when the hull was refloated and brought to the scrapyard. By evaluating their performance in combat, it can be said that the Littorio-class battleships demonstrated to be very capable of absorbing damage. This is particularly true for the damages caused by torpedoes. It is hard to give a final judgment on the Pugliese system for torpedo defense. Of the 6 torpedo hits received by Vittorio Veneto and Littorio, only one struck the area fully covered by the cylinders, while another one struck towards the terminal section where the cylinder's diameter was reduced. The cylinders proved to be very effective in absorbing the explosion of the Fritz X bomb that hit the Italia in September 1943. In my humble opinion, given the evidence we have, the Pugliese system worked out decently. Regarding their firing performances, it is true that the Italian ships suffered from higher dispersion of the shells. However, we must take into account that in the 4 occasions in which the ship fired, 3 encounters were fought at distances beyond 23 km against smaller and fast-moving targets. In the last occasion, the distances were much shorter, but scarce visibility, coupled with rough sea and weather conditions, did not facilitate the task. The dispersion problem has been the subject of many studies and inquiries also during wartime. In the literature, we can find many reasons that try to explain the problem, most notably the scarce quality of the propellant charges. However, more recent studies done by Admiral Marco Santarini of the Italian Navy proved that the main cause behind salvo dispersion was the overstabilization of the projectiles. To conclude, during World War II, the Littorio-class battleships were pivotal in making the Regia Marina a substantial naval threat that the British Royal Navy had to address. The threat level is reflected by the consistent deployment of Allied naval assets in the Mediterranean theater. This is particularly true when convoy operations were launched to resupply Malta in moments when more than one Littorio was operational. However, we must remember that the Regia Marina was generally unsuccessful in stopping the Royal Navy convoys resupplying Malta. This is crystal clear in 1940 and in 1941. While in 1942 the Regia Marina, the Luftwaffe and the Regia Aeronautica inflicted higher losses that eventually forced the Allies to divert more and more naval assets. When needed, the Italian battleships were also committed to convoy escort duties, attempting to overcome the crisis of late 1941. I hope I have provided an insightful summary of the operational life of these famous battleships, perhaps too often overlooked. As always, sources are in the description, together with the links to my social media pages. Please consider subscribing to help the channel grow. Good luck and fair seas!